You know, this time of year always gets us thinking about things. It always gets our hearts to a position where we dwell on the good things in our life. But this Thanksgiving this year has taken on a whole new meaning for me because about a year ago, I was faced with a very, very difficult thing. A few semesters ago in college, I ran into some problems, and I was unable to go back for the following semester, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but when that's where you live and that's where you work, it starts to get a little scary. Now, at that point, I was faced with two options. I could either go back to Ohio, or I could stay in Kentucky and press my luck. Well, going back to Ohio wasn't an option for me because I wasn't ready to return to that place where I was. And I decided at that point that I would press my luck and see how I could do in Kentucky. Well, I went ahead and I did that. But when I did that, my mind was in the wrong spot. My heart was in the wrong spot. I had this idea that no matter what happened, I still had my card. A few days before Christmas break had let out, it fully set in that I was not going to be returning to campus, and I needed to start really trying to find a place to live. And when I found out that, officially, I wasn't going back, I said to my friends, I was like, hey, I may not be going back to school, but at least I had my card. Well, funny thing happened. When I said that, a day later, my starter went out. And I had no money. The starter's about $120. I didn't have that. But somehow it managed to get fixed, and somehow God provided the means to fix the starter. Then I realized that I was losing my job. So I thought, all right, at least I got my car. Another fun fact, a day later my brakes went out. And not just like the brake pads, but like everything in the back, gone. Went out completely, which is pretty scary when you're going down a hill. It was small, it was on campus, it was like, everything wasn't that big. But, and then, so I had this mindset, and then I realized, like, man, I'm gonna be homeless. At least I got my car. Yeah, that lasted all of about 9 seconds until my alternator went out. I don't know why I like that car so much. But when the alternator went out, I thought to myself, all right, this is an alternator. It's an easy fix. Pop a couple bolts off, pop a few on, connect the belt, you're good to go. It wasn't that simple. The day it went out, the school had given all the students on campus $100. And then another church had given all the students on campus $50. So the day my alternator went out, I had $150. So I was good. So much so, I had my friend take me to the store. I got my part. I ran in there. I was giddy as can be. I was like, I need an alternator for 99 Mercury disabled. Let's do this. And he gave it to me. I got in the car. I was like, Slater, we're going to Taco Bell. I'm buying you lunch. As with any college kid that's taking someplace, and they're offered free Taco Bell, they pull in the Taco Bell. We get in there, we order our food, we leave, we get back to campus, and I'm happy. I've got my cart, I've got everything. I have a full belly, I have a toolkit, I have an alternator, and I have a broke car. Let's do this. So I pop the hood, take the bolts off. The bolt was a little hard to get off, but I got it off because I was determined. The alternator pops out, I look at the alternator and I see 2 mounting bolts, and I look at the new alternator and I see 3 mounting bolts. I got the wrong part. So I go back, I get another one. This time, we're good to go. Yeah, there's only a bad part. Did that 4 more times. I went through 5 alternators before I eventually just took the mechanic and he fixed it. But I realized that I had my hope and my faith in the wrong thing, because I was putting it into a car. And then as I was preparing for this sumo event and the topic of wrestling was on every 9 seconds, I realized that I think God wants me to preach on wrestling. So I started praying about it, and then the passage that's found in Genesis 32 came to mind. And I see people turning, so while you guys are turning there, let me give you some background. Genesis 32, starting in verse 22, is in my Bible, and a couple others I looked at, it says that Jacob wrestles with God. And just a brief history of this, why he's wrestling with God. The name Jacob means deceiver, trickster, swindler. And I'm kind of learned that name, because in Genesis 27, he stole his brother's birthright with the help of his mom. Isaac, meaning Jacob's father, was set to bless Esau with the birthright. He was going to give him abundant harvests, riches, bountiful new wine, many nations and servants, and he was supposed to be the master of all of his brothers. Well, he told this, and Isaac told Esau to go out and hunt wild game, get some animals, prepare his favorite meal. He would cook the meal, and then when he was fed, he would, at that point, give Esau birthright. Well, Rebecca, being Isaac's wife, Jacob, and Esau's mom, heard that and told Jacob that to go out and get some goats. Rebecca would prepare the meal. And he would get birthright. Well, Esau is a hairy man, Jacob is not. So Rebecca took the skin of the goat, put it on his hands, his face. Jacob threw on some clothes of Esau, went in there, gave the meal to Isaac, tricked Isaac into blessing it. Well, in chapter 32, Jacob is forced to meet Esau. His sins at this point are catching up to him. So he sends all of his possessions ahead of him to Esau. Kind of a way to soften him up a bit, I guess. And he sends these gifts ahead. At this point, he's left with very, very little. And in chapter 32, starting in verse 22, we're starting a couple verses ahead of that. He crosses the river the next morning leading up to this, and he sends his last of his possessions. He sends his 2 wives, 2 servant wives, his 11 sons, and he crossed the Jabbok River with them, and he took them over, he sent them off. At that point, he was left with nothing. That's where the story begins. Starting in verse 22, it says, during the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 servant wives, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. This left Jacob alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. The man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. He replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob, the man told him, for now you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Please tell me your name, Jacob said. Why do you want to know my name? The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. The sun was rising on Jacob as he left the meal, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for this time that you've given us. We thank you for the opportunity and the blessing of being able to worship and learn about you freely, Lord. We ask that you be with us throughout the service, and we ask that you go with us throughout this week. It's in your name we pray. Amen. When he crossed the river, he was left with nothing. He was emotionally and physically exhausted. And this is a guy who was, I imagine that like going up to his brother that wants to kill you isn't exactly refreshing. And he was probably really, really tired as a result. And he was fearing for his life because before he sent over his the last of his possessions, he had sent three convoys ahead of him. And the three convoys, one of his messengers came back and said, Esau's coming after you and he has an army 400 strong. So at this point, after as he begins to wrestle, he is very, very tired and he's fearing for his life. And this, at his lowest point, a man appears and wrestles with Jacob. And this isn't like one of those playthings where like a father does with a son, or like what we did yesterday where we put on inflatable sumo suits and push each other around. He was fighting for his life. I mean, this was pretty severe. Well, even though the struggle continued all night, and even though he was exhausted, and even though he was fearing for his life, the wrestling match that he had really did not shatter his faith, and it did not deter him from his prayer of getting the blessing from God that he would be received favorable with Esau. And at dawn, the man he was wrestling dislocated his hip, touching it. So now, not only is he physically tired, emotionally exhausted, fearing for his life because he just wrestled with a guy all night, fearing for his life because he's facing an army 400 strong. To make matters worse, he has a dislocated hip. He's not having a good day. And so he's laying there with a dislocated hip, all this stuff going on, and he's clinging to this guy, and he's holding on tight, and he refuses to let go until he gets his blessing. Jacob was begging for his blessing, and by doing so, he showed his inferiority. He showed that he was no match for God. Even though it appeared he had the upper hand and that he was holding on to him, and the guys asked him to let him go, he was still clinging to him in the act of touching the hip and dislocating it showed that he did not have the upper hand. Because if you're holding someone and they pop a joint out of socket, the table would turn. But he still held fast and he was begging for his blessing. And once the man and Jacob were no longer wrestling, the man gave him the blessing that he had been seeking. But he wouldn't tell him his name. But when Jacob received the blessing, he really didn't want to know his name because he got the blessing that he was looking for. Now, when I read this story for the first time at Bible college, it was when I was going through that very difficult time. And our professor posed a question. He said, what lesson can you learn from this? Don't wrestle with a guy all night? I didn't know. I was first or second year Bible college student. But I got to thinking about it, and the first thing that we can learn from this is that it's when we are able to humble ourselves unto the Lord, that is the point, until the point where he knew, and that we know that it's not him, or it's not us, but it's God. Just like at the point when Jacob was wrestling with this guy, it wasn't. Jacob was at the point where he was humble enough to realize that there was no chance that he could win this wrestling match. And there was no way that he could face Esau and find favor with him. Even though he sent all these gifts in front of him, his brother was still pretty mad. He sent out an army. But laying on the ground with a dislocated hip, emotionally exhausted, physically exhausted, just drained, he was at a point where he was humble enough, and he humbled himself unto the Lord, that he was able to receive that blessing. humbling ourselves is a very, very difficult act. Because by doing so, we acknowledge the fact that we're not as cool as we think we are, we're not as great as we think we are, and that we need a Savior. And when you humble yourself before God, you're begging, essentially, for a blessing, and the blessing of grace. Grace being something that we get, that we don't deserve. I mean, Jacob, even though his birthright was, it was immense, and God told him that he would get this birthright, he still went about it in a very, he lied. He lied. He went about it in a deceitful way, and all he really wanted was God's grace. That he didn't deserve to approach Esau, and Esau, hey, how you doing? Esau had a right to be mad, and all he wanted was the grace of the blessing of just walking with Esau, and not even him liking him, just being accepted by him. We can see by the way that he responded when the man touched his hip and popped it out of socket, that Jacob was at a humble point. Because he was laying there in excruciating amount of pain, begging for this blessing. And there are times in our lives where we put our faith in the wrong thing. When I was at college, I put my faith in a car. Should have known not to do that, but I did. Because at the time, my uncle was going through a bunch of medical problems in Ohio. And I thought, if something bad happens to him, I have my car to get me to Ohio. I was losing my job, but it's okay because I had my car to get me back and forth to filling out applications and back and forth to work if I did get a job. I didn't know where I was going to live, but it's okay because I had a car. Because if worse comes to worse, I can always sleep in the car. Because it gets cold in the mountains of Kentucky, and the car had heat. So even though all this stuff is going on, I still have my car. God doesn't want that. God doesn't want you to have that mindset. He doesn't want you to think, all right, even though this is going awful, I still have that. God doesn't want your leftovers. I mean, He wants it all. The second thing that we can learn from this is that it's in our times of struggle, when we are wrestling over circumstances in life and our situations that we think we can't get through, that we need to cling to God. The story of Jacob, he's not in a good spot. He's got an army of 400 people that wants to kill him. You're not in a good spot when you have one person coming after you to kill you. The dude had 400. Not only that, he had a dislocated hip. He had nothing in the middle of nowhere with no one else around him, wrestling with a guy all night. That is not a good spot. But it was at that moment that he clung to God. Because later on in the passage, in verse 30, it says, Jacob says, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is spared." So we know that the guy he was wrestling with was God. But yet when he was wrestling with God, he clung to him. He clung to him so much that in a way that at the end of the night, and after his hip was out of socket, the man said to him, "You can let me go now." But he was still clinging to him. He wouldn't let go until God blessed him and gave him the blessing to find favor with Esau. It's in our most vulnerable of times that we need to cling to God. But when Jacob did it, he did it when he was clinging to God. It wasn't in a way of, "I'm not letting you go until you give me my blessing." He was doing it in a sense that he was begging, but yet he was doing it for protection. Almost like a father or a child clings to his father for protection. He's not in his spot. He not only wanted the blessing, but he wanted the protection. So imagine this. After a wrestling match, he's sitting there holding on to this guy. and he's holding on to God, and he's begging for this blessing. That in and of itself shows that how humble he was at that point. Much like in our lives, but he also had two choices. He could have walked straight up to Esau without sending all of his gifts in front of him, without praying the way that he did. He could have just sent the gifts. Hope that kind of did the trick and take the risk. But do you guys really think that Esau would have been okay with that if God didn't intervene? Probably not. But instead of making the choice to just send the stuff and go on his own will, he prayed and he clung to God. Literally and figuratively. And when we have difficult times, we have the same choices. We can either cling to God or we can turn away. If we turn away, the odds really aren't going to turn up in our favor. But when we cling to him, just like Jacob clung to God, it was God that softened the heart of Esau and made it possible for him to get the blessing. And the last thing that really struck me, a lesson that we can learn from this, is that when Jacob was in the greatest times of his trouble, he appreciated the blessing more. And what I mean by that is he was left with nothing. Terrible situation. And he was facing death on two fronts. And the army and the God he was wrestling with. Can you imagine just how grateful he felt when he was in that situation and he got the blessing, as opposed to if he had just walked up to Esau and Esau accepted him favorably. He was probably so grateful at that point that words can't describe it, just because of where he was at. It was when he was humbled by the Lord that he was fully able to understand what God did in the heart of Esau. You know, when I was faced with that situation at Clear Creek, I did everything in my power to resolve it. And just when I thought that things were going to get better, it ended up getting worse. And that continued until I felt so hopeless. I didn't know what to do. But it was at my lowest point that God showed up and worked things out in a way that not only provided me with what I needed at that point, but brought a tremendous amount of glory and honor to him. You see, when I was in that situation, I was so concerned with where I was going to live. I had no idea what I was going to do. The day before I left to come to Tullahoma for Christmas break, I was cleaning an office of a professor. I walked in there and he asked if what I had planned for Christmas break, and I told him. And he asked if I was coming back next semester, and I said no. Just making small talk. He wanted to know where I was going next semester, and I told him I didn't know, but I didn't know. Well, he looked at me and he's like, "Well, you do now." He's like, "You're going to come stay with me in Carmela." Carmela being his wife. I was a bit taken aback by that, to be honest with you, but I was so grateful for that to happen, because not only did it give me what I needed, but God was glorified through that. Not only to myself, not only did I realize just how great God is through that situation, but they also, God placed me with people that not only was I able to have a place to stay, but they were able to mentor me in my relationship and walk with Christ. They helped me grow and helped me weather that difficult storm. They would have me and Randy over all the time just to hang out. They were just good people. And it was because I was at that point in my life that I was able to really appreciate that. Like when he told me that, I didn't know what to say, because And the guy saved me from sleeping in my car, and that winter was cold. But when he told me that, I was standing by trash can, and he told me that, and the realization hit me. And it was something that really, really stuck with me. And it was something that I'll never forget. And the realization was this: while we are in our situations and we're wrestling with God and we think that there's no way that things can get any worse, and somehow they do, and it is in the times that we feel like our world is crashing down around us, and that we are at our lowest point, that we have no idea what to do. And it's in those points that we question God, why these things are happening. I want you guys to remember this. It is because of the bad that we're able to appreciate the good. And it is because of the pain that we can enjoy the pleasure. And it is because of the valleys that we have the mountaintops. Let's pray. Father God, I want to thank you for this day that you've given us. I want to thank you for the blessings that you pour out for all of us each and every day. Lord, I ask that you be with us as we go about this week. I ask that you remind us just how great you are and how much you love us, Lord. Lord, I ask that you be with us as we go about the rest of our evening and just be with us, Lord. It's in your name we ask this. Amen.